Welcome. I'm Lisa Janetian. I'm a professor of public policy here at Duke Stanford, and thank you for coming on lovely Thursday afternoon. I want to thank, first of all the folks that made it possible to have today's lecture, keynote actually, which is the beginning of several folks in this audience are going to be working hard tomorrow as part of a small workshop thinking about cash transfers and what we're learning from randomized control studies, especially in the U.S. context. So we're coupling a big keynote with a smaller workshop, and I hope we can do this again in the future. The topic of poverty is sort of near and dear to me for personal reasons as well as being the focus of my work. So I'm a product of an immigrant who came here with an 8th grade education illegally to the United States. Married a person who grew up in public housing in Western Massachusetts, whose mother was raised by a single mother who was orphaned by the Armenian genocide when she was 18, and settled in a community in Eastern Massachusetts. And there was never a moment that I remember in my childhood that I wondered about food or housing, or being able to go to school down the street. And I say that story not from the perspective of saying to you, I understand what it's like to live in poverty, but rather I understand what it's like not to be right on those margins and to have the opportunity to live in a life that was pretty stable, like good working class community. So I think about that a lot today in the context of the US. And I also think about it in the context of where we are as a fractured set of policies in the US and globally, and what role does cash have to play in that sort of thing. So Paul is, I just want you to reflect on some of this. So Paul Niehaus is presently an economist at UC San Diego, and has very wide-ranging expertise from econometrics to applied microeconomics, to development economics, to labor economics. He was deemed a top 100 global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine. He is an entrepreneur, focused on capital and digital financial flows, and I will specifically name Give Directly as one of the organizations that has specialized in transferring income from one entity, charity in particular, and philanthropy to people. And some of you might know how nimble Give Directly is. In fact, they were on the ground ready to respond to the earthquake. So income poverty field looks differently for new contexts and experiences, but yet I think there's a lot we can learn when we don't think about income poverty and poverty that's defined by hard work. So Paul has some great thoughts to share with you. It'll be about 25 minutes, and then we're going to really open up to Q&A. So be ready with your questions because we want this to be a really lively conversation. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks all for coming out. Really great to see you, and it's really great to be back at Duke. The way Lisa sort of scoped this for me was to say, tell us what we've learned from the last couple of decades of research on this approach to ending extreme poverty, so direct transfers to people living in extreme poverty, but then also because tomorrow's workshop is a gathering of people who are doing some of the cutting edge work and research on this here in the US. We also think a little bit together about what are some lessons or some implications. And so I'll largely be talking about trying to give you, as you'll see, a sort of a synthesis of a very large body of research that now exists, but also in doing that, I'm trying to draw out a few of those lessons. And so a little bit of context too. Lisa said some of this, but just so you know, so Give Directly is the nonprofit. We've delivered about $700 million so far to people living in extreme poverty. These two are fintech companies that enable that by building rails. TapTap in particular is a consumer remittance company, right, that lets people send money back home. These are typically African migrants to Europe, things like that. And then in my day job at UC San Diego, I mostly work on the sort of evaluation and the performance of large-scale anti-poverty programs. So it's sort of like capital flows to people living in extreme poverty, but in all three sectors, right? Philanthropic, private, public. So that's the way I try to rationalize it. I wanted to start with this idea of learning from low-income countries about things we might want to try in rich countries because it's super exciting. In development economics in my field, there has long been emphasis on knowledge flows the other way. The sort of idea that lower-income countries are potentially behind the technology frontier and there's opportunity for them to catch up and to grow and progress quickly by learning things from rich countries. And I think there's certainly some truth in that. But now, and especially around this issue in particular of cash transfers, we're seeing like a lot of interest from people in rich countries to go and learn from the experiences of lower income countries, which I think is really neat to see. So this is an example. This is Holly Fletcher, who's the supervisor of LA County in Western Kenya, to meet with households who are participating in a basic income program that Give Directly is running there, to hear with them about their experiences. I think that's really neat to see. And so we're going to try to do a little bit of that tonight as well. I want to start with kind of where we started this conversation back about a bit over a decade ago when we started Give Directly, just to sort of remind you where we began, where this dialogue began. And so at the time, we went around and started telling people we wanted to give money to people living in extreme poverty. We tended to get pretty strong reactions to that idea. Some of them were positive, strong reactions. Many of them were very negative, strong reactions, like "you must be nuts." This is the first New York Times headline that we ever got. Or "you must be smoking crack," so very strong. The thing that's interesting about that is that at the time there wasn't an enormous amount. There was some data, some good evidence on the impacts of cash transfers, and it was generally very positive, but there wasn't as much. And certainly these reactions that we're getting were not grounded in data, right? They were grounded in, I think, many decades of perception that had built up, of prejudice perhaps that had built up. And so I want to mention that because I do think this question of giving over that much influence and control to other people and letting them be the ones who decide what gets done with resources triggers some sort of deep biases that we need to be self-aware of when we dig into the topic. That having been said, the good news is that since then there's been an enormous amount of research done. So this is a count that Give Directly staff recently did, pulling from the evidence portal that 3IE maintains and just looking at how many sort of studies have they counted so far on a bunch of these sort of big buckets of interventions that we study in global development. And so you can see that we have a lot of really good high quality studies of cash transfers here. In fact, more, probably double than any of these other big categories that we have. This is in part a cause and also in part a consequence of the fact that cash transfers have been adopted very widely around the world. This probably peaked during the pandemic because a lot of countries introduced new cash transfer programming or expanded it in order to offset some of the impacts of the pandemic. But at peak, I think probably best estimate from the World Bank is that about 1.4 billion people in low or middle income countries were receiving some form of cash transfer from their government. So there's just been enormous scale of this. And that has generated a lot of opportunities to learn, as well as having been driven by the learning, right? So there were some early influential studies, for example, of the Progresa Oportunidades program in Mexico, which were sort of widely cited and referenced as other countries around the world began adopting similar approaches. So the sort of scale, and also I mentioned here that some of these are done by Give Directly. So one thing that we felt really good about is the sort of our role in producing evidence, continuing to test what we're doing and continuing to drive thinking on some of the frontier questions in this area as we go on. Okay, so the good news is that we have a lot of studies. So the evidence base is big in this dimension, but it's also big in another dimension, which is a bit more challenging and even potentially problematic. And that is that with all of this evidence, there are now just an enormous array of different outcomes that people have looked at, different questions that people have asked. And so this is from that same 3IE database, kind of looking at all the studies and the different outcomes they've looked at. The word cloud to give you some sense of that. We've now looked at the impacts of cash transfers on pretty much anything that you can imagine that you might think you might care about. And so there's a sense in which that's good, right? Sort of almost anything that you might wonder about, we probably know a little bit about. There's also a sense in which it's sort of obvious that this would be the case because cash transfers are a very flexible thing. Right? That's sort of the whole point of it. Right? You give it to a household, they can decide what to do with it. So they're going to use some of it for education, some of it for food, they might use some of it for a project, a livelihoods investment. And different households are going to do all of those things differently. So you get this enormous heterogeneity. Right? But the problem then is sort of how to synthesize all of this, right? And what to say and how to sort of draw learnings that are relevant for decision making from all of it. Especially given that with all the studies, you can now sort of go out and find almost anything that you want, right? With enough studies and enough outcomes. Right? So the way I'm going to approach this is by first talking about a few questions, which I actually don't think are necessarily the best questions to ask of cash transfers, but which are very sort of common, very widespread. And perhaps you came here tonight with some of these questions, and so I'll tell you a bit about those. But then pivot to thinking a little bit more systematically about the lens I'd want to bring to the question of cash transfers, and then what research questions I'd ask as a result. Okay, so three things that a lot of people want to know about cash transfers are, what do people do with the money? How do they use their time differently, if at all? In particular, are they working more or less? And then sort of, are there some broader measures, subjective measures of well-being, or some measures on which people seem to be better off as a result? Right? If I wanted something that would somehow synthesize all of those other outcomes, what would this look like? So I want to talk about each of these. can do. In terms of what people have done with the money, it is incredibly diverse, right, as you can imagine. I think it's fair to say that across a wide number of studies, people use money in ways that are positive, that make their lives better. A lot of people have this concern that a significant share of people might waste the money and use it on things that are actually self-harmful or counterproductive, right? They might use it on alcohol or drugs or tobacco. And so to the extent that studies have looked at that systematically, the answer seems to be no, if anything, the opposite in the data so far. That when people have done the meta-analysis of the literature, if anything, it seems like there are some modest reductions in the amount that people are spending on those things that economists call temptation goods, alcohol, tobacco, things like that. I do think there's an important grain of salt there in that most of that is either reported by households themselves, or sometimes you ask sort of, one spouse about their partner's drinking habits, or you ask people about their neighbor's drinking habits. And that's, I think useful and about the best we have. I think it would be nice to do this with biomarkers. And that's something that people are actually thinking about doing now. But to the extent we have data on this so far, I think these sort of very negative concerns that people are just going to drink the money away certainly have not been borne out of the data. There's a second thing, though, that people worry about, which is, great, maybe people are going to use money in ways that help them today, but they're not going to use money in ways that help them in the longer term, right? They're not going to invest it or do things that have longer term impacts, which I honestly think is a bit of an odd sort of prior to have, in the sense that, you just see descriptively, if you go look at what people are doing with the money they have now, that there's a mix of those things, right? They're spending some money on food for today, and they're spending some money on education and investments and so forth. And so it would be odd if they didn't sort of spend incremental money in a similar way. But I'd say that's also generally been the picture, right? That we see people using some money to meet today's needs, but also starting businesses, also sending kids to school or pulling kids out of child labor, things like that, doing things that you can expect to have longer term impacts and benefits. And so we can debate whether they're getting all those decisions right, but it's certainly not the case that people are super myopic and they're just thinking about today's problem. In terms of how people use their time, this one's actually very easy to answer. And the answer is that systematically across the board, right, you don't see people reducing the amount they work. You do see some interesting shifts out of working for other people and into working for yourself. So out of wage employment and towards self-employment. And I think that has a lot to do with the nature of the economies in which people live, right, in which there aren't that many good jobs available to them. And oftentimes the best opportunity is to get the tools that you need to apply your trade or to do it yourself. And so in some sense, that's exciting, right? It means that people are free to do things themselves. But I also think that it exposes them to a lot of risk, and it's indicative of the kind of situation they're in, which is the fact that there aren't a lot of good jobs available. And that's one thing which I would expect could be very different in richer countries, where the costs of starting up some sort of small business are much higher, right? The entry costs, the capital requirements are very different. And so that'll be something interesting to look at. On this third point, also the answer here, I think, is pretty clear that across the board, these studies generally find improvements on some of these broader measures of mental well-being, subjective well-being, mental health, standardized measures of depression, things like that. We pretty consistently see people being less depressed, happier, things like that. My favorite example of this actually comes from a GiveDirectly study where they measured the biomarker cortisol. So they took samples of people's saliva and measured how stressed they were using salival cortisol and found reductions in that from large cash transfers. And so for me, my levels of cortisol are probably like the good indicator of how I'm feeling at any point in time. And so I sort of like that. But so I'd say that generally speaking, the answers to these questions pretty clear and pretty positive so far. Now, one last thing I want to mention is, you might reasonably think it's good to know what the impacts of this are, but we care about the impacts relative to alternatives, right? What are other things that we could have spent the money on, and how does this approach, just giving money to people, compare to that? And there have been far fewer studies that have done that. It's actually fairly uncommon in development economics these days to run a study that tests two different approaches head to head in the same setting and in the same population. And so that's a limitation, not just with respect to cash transfers, but more generally. One thing we've done at GiveDirectly, which I think has been very exciting, has been to partner with USAID to do this, to take some of their conventional programming, which has been designed by experts to move specific outcomes in a specific setting, and then say, what would happen if we just took the naive approach of taking the same money, giving it to the same people, and letting them decide what to do with it. And so we've done a few of these studies now, and if you know anything about USAID, I think for them to do something like this is just incredibly courageous and very difficult. And they've sort of done 5 RCTs in their entire life, and so now they're doing a bunch of them with us, and it's great. These are the results from one of them in Rwanda. There have been 3, I think, that have produced results so far. And so consistently across most of these, I'd say that other people's sort of subjective reading of them is it seems like the cash flow bet, sort of the bottom line. And you can look at them and sort of form your own opinion. This is the case in Rwanda where the answer is totally unambiguous because USAID said these are the 5 primary outcomes that we should focus on, right? And those are the outcomes that this program had been designed to move. And the cash transfers have more impact on those outcomes. Now, of course, cash transfers are not designed to move these specific outcomes, right? People could do whatever they want with them. So I think of that as sort of a low bar, that like, hey, if we can't design programs that do more than this very simple approach of just giving the money away, we need to go back and think. So I think more studies like this would be helpful, but that's what we're seeing so far when we put these things head to head benchmarking. That's a case where it's unambiguous, but more generally, it's very difficult. Right? You can imagine all the other things that people did with their money in that study, right, that are not one of those 5 primary outcomes that I just showed you. Think about, well, how do we incorporate those? Or think about that huge word cloud that I showed you a minute earlier. Think about how would we value all of those things in some coherent way. And this is also a big problem in development economics these days. We talk a lot about program evaluation, but the reality is you can't really evaluate something without valuing the things that you're measuring, right? Without saying how useful they are. And especially when you look at an intervention like cash transfers that has impacts on such a wide array of things, it becomes very difficult. Right? How would I take impacts on mental health and some impacts on schooling and maybe some impacts on cortisol levels and investments and all these different things and somehow get to a bottom line, right, of what all of that is worth? In economics, we primarily rely on cost effectiveness analysis to say sort of how good are the different things we're looking at. And it's sort of a poorly kept secret that if you look at all the people who promote cost-effective analysis and say we should do more of it, which I think is not a bad thing, in all the manuals it says at some point, oh, and by the way, it only works if you have one outcome. And when you have more than one outcome, we're not really sure what to do, right? And that's essentially just about every program evaluation situation that you're in. So what do you do? The irony about this is that when we talk about the value of something, what we often mean by that is, what would somebody be willing to give up to get it? Or what price can it command in the market? For what can you sell it? And so if you use those notions of value, right, the answer for cash transfers is incredibly simple, which is that the value of $1 is $1, right? What I'd be willing to give up to get $1 is $1. What I could get for $1 in the marketplace is $1. And so there's no deep insight in, right? That is just sort of a tautology that follows from using money as the numeraire, right? As the way in which we assign and keep track of value. And yet I still think it's a helpful starting point, right, for thinking about this question of value. It sort of pushes us to say, well, that doesn't feel right. It feels like just saying the value of giving someone $1 is not capturing something that seems important to me about the world. Like, what is that thing? And then push us to think more systematically about that. So one framework that I find very helpful for thinking about that is to step out of my own life today, right? Saying, for me, Paul, today, if you said, how much would you want, how would you value $1? I'd say $1, right? And to kind of put myself behind sort of John Rawls' veil of ignorance, right? This sort of rhetorical or logical device that asks us to imagine that we don't know who we are, right? That we could end up being anybody in society or anybody in the world. And then ask from that point of view, how would we value different ways of arranging society? Which would seem to us the most fair, the most just, which would we actually want to live? Which world do we want to live in? And so you can imagine that behind that veil of ignorance, this idea of $1 is worth $1 to everybody, no matter who it goes to, very quickly seems not quite right. Because I might prefer to live in a society where the dollar is more likely to go to somebody who's more disadvantaged to begin with. Or I might like to live in a society where the dollar is more likely to go to somebody who has more untapped opportunities and could take advantage of them if they had that dollar. Right? So you see, it's a very simple device, but it sort of quickly gets us beyond this tautology of $1 is $1 and pushes us towards thinking about what I think are some of the right questions to ask. And so I'm going to, in the second half of this little talk about 3 questions that, to me, occur naturally once you start thinking about the world this way, which I think are important questions to ask of cash transfers and tell you what we know about those. And so those are, the first is the one that I just mentioned, right? Are transfers benefiting the right people? The second is, are we structuring transfers the right way, especially taking into account what we know about how difficult financial life is for people living at the margins, right, at the edge of extreme poverty, and how poorly financial markets function for those people. And then the third is, how are the transfers affecting the people who don't get them, which, as you'll see, is a challenging question, but I think a very exciting research one too. On the first, I think Duncan Thomas is not here. Duncan, are you here? Well, I was going to credit Duncan because Duncan was one of the Duke economists and one of the first people to really draw attention to the fact that the allocation of resources within households in many countries is not entirely equitable, right? That some people benefit more than others. I think that, to me, the sort of most vivid statistics that drive this home are from a recent paper here on malnutrition that show that the most malnourished people in many societies are not in the poorest households. Right? Many of them are, in fact, in households that, in terms of their economic standards of living, are not the poorest, right? But because the distribution of resources within those households are inequitable, you still find undernourished kids, right, and undernourished women. And so when you think about a society like this, right, that has this particular pattern, it's clear that we want to think not just about targeting resources to the poorest households, but also about who within the household benefits from them, and whether that's something that we can influence through the design of the program. So I think that would be a very important question. We know a lot about how to target benefits to the people that are poorest in a sort of per capita household income sense, but very little about what to do about this. Right? So I think that's an important frontier. And Lisa, maybe we'll talk about this, but within the US as well, right? I think one of the reasons the child tax credit did not get renewed is because there were people that were concerned that while we call it a child tax credit, it actually goes to the parents, and how much of that is actually going to get to the children in a benefit sense. Cool. So the second question I think you'd ask in terms of are the money going to the right people is not just is it going to the people that are the worst off without it, but are we getting it to people who have untapped opportunities? And the first study on this is one that I've been involved in. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of this picture. It's something that I've been very excited about. One of the reasons I'm excited about this is that the tooling to do this from a technical point of view, the machine learning tools that we use to do this, was only developed in the last 4 or 5 years, right? So this is something that we can only recently begin to do in a pretty good way. So what we do in this paper is we say we look at a large cash transfer program, and we look at the impacts it has on different households. And we say, if we try to predict which households were the poorest if they didn't get the money, and that's on the x-axis in this graph. So low values here to the left means that you would have been really poor if you didn't get the money. But then we also try to predict who experienced the biggest gains when they did get the money. And that's on the y-axis here, right? What does the relationship between those two things look like? And so what I want you to see in this picture is that there's a lot of variation in both of those things. There are some people who are very poor and also experience large gains when they receive the transfer. So that's like the upper left quadrant here. But there are also some people who experience really big gains even though they're not the poorest in these societies. And so there's potentially a trade-off here that we need to think about between targeting to the people who are most deprived and targeting to the people who are the most impacted by the program, at least on this map. So that's the second frontier. For this, by the way, you need an enormous amount of data, right? We have what is like big data by development economist standards for this project. It is not big data by machine learning standards. And so we're really kind of pushing the limits of what the algorithms could do. So in terms of what things the studies could do in sort of rich countries where potentially get access to large data sets, that's one asset that would be very valuable to have. Okay. The second question I posed is, are we structuring transfers in the right way? First, just to set the baseline, the way most transfers are structured today is that everybody gets a small payment monthly or potentially bi-monthly. And I think the reason for that is that most of the cash transfer programs in the world were designed with sort of social protection in mind, trying to make sure that people are able to meet their basic needs, to put food on the table, these kinds of things. And there's some sense in that. There's certainly true that people face a lot of volatility and instability. And so having a regular, predictable source of income could be very valuable to them. In this project, we asked people, how would you structure it if it was up to you? So we said, take a fixed amount of money. We're going to give it to you over the next 12 months. Would you like to get it in 12 monthly installments? That would have been this one right here. Or would you like to get it in fewer, larger tranches? And so what you can see here is that overwhelmingly, people do not want the design that is what they typically get today, right? What they actually want is a few larger tranches, right? And by the way, this is not because you're going to get the money tomorrow, right? If you choose fewer tranches, it's equally likely to come at any time in the next 12 months. So what this says to me is, something that's not at all surprising if you've read and learned about the financial lives of people living in extreme poverty, which is it's really difficult to accumulate large lump sums to do anything, to pay school fees, to purchase an asset, build a house, whatever it is you want to do. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of temptation. People are often very aware of that, and it's difficult for them to save up because they're tempted to use the money on something that comes up. And so for them, it's very helpful. And in fact, you see this in private sector contracts now that there are some firms that will actually give their employees an option to defer wage payments so that several of them come at the same time. You would never want that in a sort of like simple neoclassical rational model of decision making. You never want the money to come later. You always want it to come earlier. But people actually like that because it helps them put together enough money to do something that feels significant to them. Right? So that's one dimension. A second dimension that we look at here in the paper is if you could decide when the money comes, would you like it to come right away or a little bit later? Right? And here again, we see that, a lot of people want the money to come right away, which is what you might have guessed, right? Well, probably most of us would choose. But there's a significant minority who would like the money to come a little bit later. Oh, I'm sorry. These are both the tranching preferences. Well, I'll just tell you this then. So it's about 27% of the people in the sample who would prefer at least a little bit of delay, right? And why is that? When you talk to them, it's interesting because they'll say, well, this is the time of year when it's, best to do the project that I have in mind, or I need to finish planting and then it'd be a good time to build a house. There are lots of different reasons people have. But again, this is something that would be very simple to accommodate in the design of our programs, but we don't do currently today. Right? So I think that in low-income countries, there's a big opportunity to re-optimize the design of the existing programs in ways that are fiscally neutral, right? That do not cost government anymore, but that are much more responsive to and reflective of the realities of financial life at the margins. They'll be excited to tap into, right? So a very simple thing, for example, that I would do if you have the opportunity to pitch this to any of your friends in government would be to say, let's take one of these programs and just give people the option to defer a few payments so they come at the same time, right? That would be a simple version that would achieve both of these two goals, right? Of making it easier to tranche money in large lump sums and easier to time money to the times when you actually need it the most. Okay, so this last issue of what happens to the people that aren't themselves the recipients of the transfer. There's sort of an interesting history behind this. Like, development economics has changed dramatically in the last 20 years because of the experimental movement, right? This movement towards conducting randomized controlled trials. And I want to emphasize controlled, right? The key idea is that there is a control group that you can identify who was not affected by the treatment, and you can compare them to the person who got the money, right? And so I think everybody's mindset is it's very important to establish the integrity and the validity of the control group. Right? And that's true if the only thing I want to know is what was the impact of the treatment on the person who got it, right? Then it's true. I need a control group that sort of gives me a good counterfactual for that. But from an ethical point of view, we care just as much about the guy in the control group as about the guy in the treatment group, right? They're the same. We care about impacts on both of them. So you'll sometimes hear people say, well, it may be that there was a little bit of an impact indirectly on the person in the control group, but we don't have to worry about that because it's probably small. Maybe there were just a few treated people and there are many people in the control group, right? And so we're getting a good estimate. That may be true in the sense that we're getting a good estimate of the treatment effect on the treated person, but those small impacts on many, many people could add up, and they could be significant in terms of our overall assessment of the impact this has, right? Okay, so what about cash transfer specifically? Well, if you think a little about it, the whole point of cash is to enable people to transact. And so whether that means going out and buying food or buying an asset, or even putting money into a savings account, which is not what most people do with it, but even if you were to do that, to put it into some form of financial intermediation, you're transacting with somebody. And so you're almost certainly going to have at least some impact on somebody else in the economy, right? At a minimum. On top of that, of course, we see things like people are pulling out of the labor force into self-employment. That's going to put upward pressure on wages, right? There are a whole host of different ways in which you can expect an intervention like this to impact the economy more broadly, irrespective of whether you got money or not. So this is a study in Western Kenya that we designed to try to get at this. And the key thing I want you to see here is that the dots here represent villages. The black ones are villages where everybody received treatment, and the white hollow dots are control villages in which nobody did. And there's a lot of spatial variation in this, right? So there are some areas of the map in which most of the neighboring villages got treated, and some areas of the map in which most of them did not. And so the essential idea in this study is to say, let's look not only at the impacts of your village and your household receiving transfers, but let's also look at the impacts of what's happening in the surrounding area, these 2-kilometer rings that we're drawing around these people, and see what impacts that has as well. And this works well in a rural area, right? So here we can draw these rings, and it's plausible that space is a pretty important constraint on interaction, right? So if your neighbors get money, they're probably shopping at your shop, or perhaps hiring you to do some casual labor, right? This would be harder to do in a rich country where space doesn't constrain the way we interact as tightly, right? But there are some other benefits potentially of doing things like this in a rich country that we can talk about. So what do we find? We do a bunch of things in this paper, but the main thing we do is try to estimate what was the aggregate impact on the economy of these transfers, taking into account both the impacts on the people who got them and also on the people who did not. And so the numbers that we come to here are estimates of what economists call the multiplier, the transfer multiplier, that are in the range of 2.3 to 2.5x what was transferred initially. So in other words, for every dollar that was put into this economy, GDP expanded in it by between 2.4, to about $2.4. So that's a really significant multiplier. In the US, to give you a frame of reference, economists typically estimate multipliers from government spending in the range of sort of 1.6 to 1.9. So this is big relative to that, not crazy big, but as you might expect, a bit bigger than what we see in the US. So we talk in the paper about why this is. I think there are lots of things that are some interesting economics underlying this. I think part of it is just that these economies have a lot of slack capacity. So think of a shopkeeper who's sitting there waiting for customers to come by and typically serves 2 or 3 customers a day. And if there are more people in the community who have money to spend, you can serve more customers. Sometimes I think it's as simple as that. Okay? But the bottom line point here is that if you go in asking this question, really take seriously what the impacts are on the people who didn't get transfers, you ask different questions and end up reaching conclusions that I think are first order important for thinking about how much money should we be putting towards cash transfers. So I'll close with that and maybe generalize that a little bit to say, beyond any of the specific points that I've shared with you today, which I hope are helpful, the theme that I want to draw out from all of it is that the questions that we ask as researchers are not value neutral. And economists are really prone to this. So I was saying to Lisa, right, we're very prone to saying, our job is just to produce facts. And then it's other people's job to think about how to value them and to make value judgments and to make policy. But the problem with that is that we make decisions about which facts to produce in the first place. And so an example of this that I'll close with is in the sort of cash transfers literature, there's a bunch of work comparing cash transfers to giving people food and asking which of these has a bigger impact on nutrition outcomes and food consumption. Why do we ask that question? Well, we ask it because there are organizations whose purpose is to increase food security, which is a good thing, right? And I'm all for. But if you come to the problem from that very narrow lens, you ask this question saying, well, which thing does more per dollar to increase food security, nutrition, reduce hunger, things like that? That's ethically pretty problematic because all the things that people spend money on that are not food are valuable as well, right? And we don't want to discount them or undervalue them simply because they don't move this one particular outcome that we as an organization are focused on. But you see a lot of research like this, right, in the cash transfer space. So let me close with that thought, that I think as we kind of move from thinking about research in low-income countries to high-income countries, there are lots of questions you could ask about to what extent different results are going to generalize. Are we going to see impacts on this that are similar or different? I think there are some interesting questions we can ask about how the opportunities are different. Right? What are some things that may have been very hard to do in these settings that would be easier to do here? But I really think the fundamental thing is to be grounded in a clear ethical framework when we think about which questions we ask in the first place and what constituencies we're catering to when we do that. So, thanks, and I'm super excited to discuss.
Thank you, that was great. Just going to open it up. I mean, I'm prepared with questions, but I hope that there's lots in the audience. Anyone want to start with a question? I'll go.
Hi, Lisa. Well, thanks for this talk. It's great. And your work is great, of course. I do want to ask you a little bit. You talked about the design of those interventions. You talked about inequalities within households and families. And I wonder, where is our understanding at this point about how we design, who gets the money, and how decision-making occurs in those complicated units that are families, households, whatever you want to call it. Great, thank you.
And so I was asked to repeat the questions just so everybody can hear. And so the question was sort of, what do we actually know so far about how to design transfers in ways that sort of influences the allocation of resources within households? And so it's a great question. Interestingly, we don't know too much about the two things that, to me at least, would seem the most obvious, but for very different reasons. So one obvious question is like, which member of the household gets the transfer? And overwhelmingly, the transfers that have been delivered in low-income countries to date have been given to the female head of household when that's possible, right? Because people had a very strong prior that is the best way to do it, right? And that prior may be right, but because of that, we actually have very little evidence on whether it matters, right? We don't know if that was an important decision or an irrelevant decision, right? And of course, it could be that, two people have very different views on how money should be spent, and I give them to one of them, but de facto, they don't have that much decision-making power, and so it didn't matter in the end, right? So the related question to that you could ask is, well, maybe the way in which we give money to you makes a difference. Maybe if I just hand it over in cash, that's one thing. But if I put it in an account with your name on it and it sits there until you're ready to take it out, that gives you a lot more control over it. And that's something that I think would be very feasible to test. It has been done for some other related interventions. So for example, for an employment program in India, we've tested giving money to the woman in an account with her name on it versus a household or a spousal account, and it made a big difference, right? For microcredit loans, for example, there's recently a study that showed that loans that are dispersed to a woman through an account with her name on it are used differently and invested more than loans that are dispersed in cash, right? So I think there's like a very strong prior that this probably matters for social protection, cash transfer programs as well, but that hasn't been done yet. And so that's something I'd love to see.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. When we briefly met before you started, I mentioned that I was with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and we used also cash transfers, and to the best of my knowledge, my colleagues still do, but it was mostly in the context of disasters, natural disasters, man-made disasters, or in refugee situations to bridge immediate needs. Yeah. And but what do you think the longer term effect? If you now talk about more longer term development, do you see a risk of creating dependencies? That's the first question. Second question, when we look at the effects or potential effects on people who do not get the cash transfer, obviously it's not enough to have any kind of effect on the currency or an inflationary pressure. But nevertheless, it could, in a kind of a microscopic way, lead to some kind of a Dutch disease phenomenon that the prices go up for everybody else.
Great. So yeah, two questions. One, I'm going to paraphrase as best I can, but sort of how should we think about cash transfers, not just for meeting the immediate needs of sort of refugees, people in humanitarian crises, after disasters, things like that, but for sort of longer term development. And then second, sort of what about potential impacts on prices? What do we know about that? Is there a risk of Dutch disease? So on the first, I think, this is an area that GiveDirectly has been super excited about and has begun to do some work in, because it's right that the humanitarian space, these two pillars, right, of sort of longer term development and humanitarian. The humanitarian side has been far more receptive to cash transfers. I think there's a very strong ethos of sort of respect for the autonomy and the dignity of people that is conducive to that. But it does tend to be these small payments to sort of make sure that things don't go horribly wrong for people, right, during or after a disaster. And so we've been saying that in the same way you see here, I think that it'd be exciting to see what happens if we give people a larger chunk of money and see what sorts of investments and longer term plans it enables them to make. So in the humanitarian settings, specifically, I think we have the first results on this from Uganda that are just coming out right now. So it's a protracted displacement setting, right? And I'm sure you know, some of you may know as well, after a crisis, after people are displaced, they often end up in some sort of temporary settlement for a very long time, right? So it's not very temporary. In fact, those are 18, 20 years in a camp or a settlement. So that's a setting where I think trying this of saying, giving people the capital to do something meaningful would be really powerful. Outside of the humanitarian setting, there have been some studies like that have given people large amounts of money and tracked them for a long term. It's funny, sort of some of them have found sort of significant long-term impacts, and then during the pandemic, those went away, and then they come back again after the pandemic. So I think we're still sort of learning and have fewer studies on that. But to me, the kind of core intuition is, for it to allow people to invest, it's got to come in larger lump sums than what we've typically been giving them. And that's the thing it's interesting to test. So, in terms of price effects, this is a core question and something we were very interested in that study that I just showed you there. So in that one, for example, we gathered price data from around 50 markets locally, very comprehensively, to look at what was happening at prices as a function of the intensity, right, with which the area they were getting had been treated with transfers. And so there we see quite small impacts. So you do see some upward pressure on prices, but it's like we were bringing in transfers that amounted to about 18% of GDP, and prices were going up by about 0.1, 0.2% of GDP. So a little bit, but fairly modest, right? It could be worse in more remote areas that are less integrated into the economy. There's a study in Mexico, for example, that found in very remote Mexican villages, there was more meaningful upward pressure on prices from cash transfers. So it's something that you'd want to think about, but I'd say I feel sort of reasonably good so far.
Thank you. How about back there, and then you, Matt. Back there. Yeah.
Sure, thank you all. My name is Ian Gishbeck. I'm a second year master's public policy student here at Stanford. And as I'm hearing you talk about kind of different ways of analyzing the viability of these programs, one piece I wanted to ask about is the political viability, right? Knowing that, at least in the U.S. context, we see that we stuck on notions of kind of deserving and undeserving folks, and a lot of our more emotional arguments about who gets what centers on, people rightly or wrongly, and I would argue often wrongly, feeling like the people that don't deserve some benefit are getting something, while people that do deserve some social benefits are not getting what they need. And I'm wondering, in the work that you are doing, have you also kind of thought about or looked into ways of building political viability for these kinds of initiatives, and ultimately that they'll happen outside of government?
Yeah. So, first, the situation in low and middle income countries in some ways very different because they've been like very widespread adopters of cash transfers. It's actually largely been sort of foreign donors that have been more reluctant to do that. And there's exciting. DFID, for example, in the UK, now FCDO have funded a lot of these. But these are largely sort of like locally led programs, and I think that's in part because they are sort of responsive to voters in a way that USAID, for example, is not. But I think it's a good question. So the way I think about this is I do think that to some degree we need to be pragmatic about addressing the concerns people have, right? And that's kind of what I showed you in that first set of questions of saying, look, let's just be real. Like this is something that's, for some people, this is the reason they're skeptical, and we need to address it head on and find out if it's true. And I mean, look, if we found out that a lot of people use money in ways that are self-harmful, that would change my view of it as well. So fair enough. I think there's a risk, though, in doing too much of that it ends up sort of catering to that worldview, to those preferences too much. So, I think in terms of like a more positive way of thinking about it, to some extent, the impact evaluations can help with that. But I think that it's often much more about the narratives we tell about what a fair society would look like. And so one of the things that we've thought and talked about is rather than the narrative of social protection, which is like, hey, a fair society is one in which people who fall on hard times for no fault of their own should get some help, right? That's not a bad narrative. It doesn't command sort of universal agreement or appeal, right? But in India, for example, we talked about the idea of an inclusive growth dividend. So the idea that to some extent, when the country as a whole progresses, everybody, that's a sort of a shared benefit that results from government investment, public infrastructure, things like that. What if we design things in such a way that everybody benefited from that to some small extent and based a cash transfer around that? Now, the impacts of that cash transfer might not be different, but the implied narrative about why people are getting the money and why that amount of money and why that's a reasonable thing to do is very different. And so I think experimentation in that space is probably as or more important as, sort of more tests of the impacts. Yeah. The permanent fund in Alaska is probably the best example of that, right? That there's like a clear story for why people are getting that money that is not social protection that's accepted. Right?
I'm Matt Johnson, professor at Stanford. Awesome talk. I was curious, you brought up really important questions about the design of these programs, but I was curious how you all give your regular thing about scale, right? So these effects are amazing, right? And, one reaction was like, wow, we just got to do the cash everyone. But of course, that's probably not true for a lot of reasons. Price effects, like the spillover effects change, the marginal benefits change. Like, how are you all thinking about like scale? Like what's sort of the optimal, scale of these programs?
Great. So the question is scale and how we think about that. I would give directly or how we should think about that more generally. So I'd say a few things. The first is that, actually cash transfers are already at scale, sort of bigger scale than essentially anything else, right? So in terms of things that we know we can do at very large scale, just in terms of feasibility, they're already kind of clearly the established benchmark for other stuff. And so I think that's important because there are other things that are going to be very high impact in sort of smaller areas or over sort of smaller ranges, right? So a lot of the stuff, for example, that GiveWell recommends that we give our charitable donations to are things that I think will have huge impacts in sort of the areas where there's a big problem with worm load or a big problem with malaria. So that's great, but that's not going to solve extreme poverty globally, because for many people, that's not the issue, right? So both in terms of the viability of delivering them and also the sort of relevance or the ability to have some positive impact, I think cash transfers are going to be the most scalable thing we have. The constraint really is on the funding side. The thing that I'm thinking about, and maybe if we chat again in a year or two, I'll have some numbers for you, is like, what would it cost, in fact, to end poverty using using cash transfers at scale? And so, what I can tell you right now is that the global poverty gap, right, the amount by which people who are below the extreme poverty line are below it, if you add all of that up, sort of in the ballpark of around $100 billion a year, which is like, maybe a fraction of a percentage point of GDP in rich countries. So that's a very solvable problem, right? It's going to cost more than that because we can't perfectly target the exact right amount to everybody. And so that's the math that I'm interested in doing, right? But I think that's an interesting way to kind of describe, scale, which is to say, this is on the scale of going to, and, do it realistically, it's going to be on the scale of a fraction of a percent of GDP for us to end, what I think is one of humanity's biggest problems.
Over there. Sorry, I don't know everyone's name in the audience. Please say your name and we'll come back to this side.
Hi, I'm Norbert Foy, first year at MIT. So you mentioned about, first of all, interesting that you were co-founder at Subset. I'm a co-founder that I So when you mentioned about like how this money is transferred, how you had an effect on how it was used, I was, as somebody who's like an African too, I get to send money back. Have you guys looked into like who gives this money? How does that affect how it's spent? Because for us, we believe sometimes as family members, they think it's going to keep coming. Oh, I have to spend money on 100K to solve it. Needs to be said, no, $100,000. You send it, and then next week, they tell you a story of what happened to it that you need to send. Well, you guys look into like who's giving this money? Does that affect how that money is used?
That's great. Yeah. We haven't. I bet it does. My short answer. What Give Directly has generally done is we'll give, typically if it's up to us, right? If we don't have a donor telling us how they want to structure the program, we'll typically give people money all at once in one large lump sum and then move on. And that's largely because, both sort of our economic logic and also people's preferences tell us that's what they prefer. And it also avoids any of these questions of like, is it going to distort behavior if people think like, maybe I can get more money if I tell this story or do this thing, right? There's just, by design, there is no scope for that. So what I will say in terms of like, does it matter who the money is coming from? And by the way, like funny stories form if you don't. So it's important to actually have a clear story for that. Like for a long time, everybody thought the money came from Barack Obama because we were working in the areas that Barack Obama was from. So it's like that was the story that got out, right? So, oh, and there was one other area where the story was that it was coming from the Illuminati and that we were going to come back. So, like rumors spread quickly if you don't have and it's a very strange thing to show up with a huge amount of money and say we're giving it away for free, right? Of course, people can ask questions. So, but, there are studies that sort of look at labeling and say, if we give people money, but say it's for this, or this is the reason that it's being done, it's for education, things like that. And that does seem to matter in the studies that have been done so far. And so I think for that reason, my prior is that it would also matter, if I said it's from this person, this is the reason they gave it, right? To some extent.
Yeah. Hi, this is Rana. I'm from India, public policy graduate student first year. It's interesting for me because I've come from a state of Andhra Pradesh where there's a lot of PBTs that is being preferred by the government over there. First thing which I'd like to ask is that now we take a process of a government policy, right? If you take nutrition, now in India we give out nutritious meals to pregnant women and lactating women just so they can get that nutrition supply during that tenure. So now that food has been eliminated and replaced by money, and obviously they're all happy, they get the money, and the utility of the money is questionable. How do we ensure that we go back to the process where we started in the long run when we realize that this money is being used for different purposes? How do we actually reverse the entire process, and is there any way to go back from DBT and to actually stick to the standard processes? That's the first question. And second question is that if you would have to relate to the DBTs advocating governments versus the taxes that they are charging on, let's say, debatable products of consumption, like alcohol, cigarettes, do you think they would have gone certainly, they would have surged up, or like it's not the case?
Could you say the second one again? I'm just not sure I understood that one.
So the correlatability between the governments who advocates direct beneficiary transfer and for them to actually tax people, like what sort of products would they be looking to tax from people? Specifically, it has to be consumed by masses. So that's the reason I was sticking to alcohol and cigarettes and all those other products.
I see. So on that question, are you asking, what if we think about a portfolio of policies that include unconditional transfers, but then also like aggressive taxation of things that we want to discourage? And so could that be an interesting mix? And I think that makes sense. I mean, in fact, those are often fairly aggressively taxed because they're like, fairly inelastic. So they're a good source of revenue. And also because, voters like that. They're sort of happy to kind of punish those guys for doing bad stuff. So, I mean, the first question you asked, if I understood it, is sort of if we move in this direction and then later decide that we don't like it, right? How can we then move back? Is that right? So, it's interesting. So, I mean, I am, frankly, somewhat skeptical of some of the premises. Actually, we just have the first paper, study of transfers to sort of pregnant and lactating women through the ICDS system, not from Andhra, but from Jharkhand, right? So if you want to follow up with me afterwards, I can share that with you and sort of see the impact that had on sort of kids' anthropometrics and development and things like that. So I'm actually quite positive about that. Not because I think that the meals served at the Anganwadi centers are necessarily bad, but because, we have good evidence that the cash transfers are helping on the things that are meant to be helped there. So, but I think that this sort of question of like flexibility is, I think we have a lot more today because of the kinds of infrastructure we have available. So India is a good example, right? Where for a long time we gave like, free electricity to farmers, for example, not because we actually thought that was the best way to help farmers, but just because that was the thing for which we had infrastructure. Like we literally had wires to give people electricity. We did not have like bank accounts in which we could give people money. So I think we're moving into an era in which we have a lot more flexibility and that it will be easier, at least logistically speaking, to move back and forth in between these things, right? Now, the other thing that happens is that, vested interests form around a new program. People like it. They want to keep it going. And so that is certainly hard to do. And that's certainly been my experience in India. The reform of anything, no matter how brain dead it was, is very difficult, right? Because there are people who want to keep it the way it is. So I'm very sympathetic to that, right? In fact, one of the things that I would love to see, if there are any historians in the room, is I think there have been a number of episodes throughout history where people have tried to take some subsidy that we all agree is a bad idea and replace it with unconditional payments. Some of these have succeeded. So, for example, the EU, as I understand it, has been able to decouple payments to farmers, right? So that it's no longer a function of how much you grow this year, but it's a function of historically what you did. But other efforts of this have failed, right? And electricity in India is an example where it's failed to date, right? So I'd be very interested to see sort of deep work on why some of those work and don't, because I think it gets to the political economy around them. So I realize I'm thinking about how to change things in the opposite direction of what you just asked about, but I think that probably the sort of analysis is similar.
I'm Pedro from PhD. And you said that when the person receives the money, she can choose to spend a lot of things, and it's very difficult to predict where the person will spend the money. And it's very, as you said, it's very difficult to judge like what's better to spend in education or in health. But you also said that it causes a reduction in stress, which I think it's like an ambiguous good. So
PhD students, I think that always resonates, right?
uh,
For PhD students, that always resonates.
yeah,
The lower cortisol levels, right? Yeah.
So my question is, do you know what kind of expenses reduce more the anxiety, or what drives
Yeah.
reduction stress?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so obviously we're not gonna, I think sort of we're gonna vary all those things together for one shot, right? What I think you could do is say, can I predict for which kinds of people the reductions in stress are largest? And then what else is true about those people in terms of the way they spend money, right? So that would be doable with data from experiments like the ones that we've run, stress or depression or whatever these things are. And so I think that would be interesting to do. Yeah, I think you can probably download data from some papers and do that thing. Yeah, good idea.
Yes, in the back with the white sweater.
I have a question about your opposition. Where does it come from? I'm sure there is.
Right.
Is it missionaries? Is it food distributors? Who doesn't like what you do?
Thank you. So the question, very well posed, was who doesn't like what we do? So I guess we're thinking of Give Directly here specifically, right? Is that, or we're not thinking of who doesn't like university-based researchers, right? There are also a lot of people who don't like that. So, but you're thinking of Give Directly, is that right?
Is the question specific to Give Directly or is academic researchers?
The question is specifically about cash transfer programs in general.
Okay.
And since you are in the midst of it, you probably have a better read than I would.
Right. I don't think there's a lot of vocal opposition. And I think that's partly because there's pretty good evidence that says we should be doing more of this, not only this, but more of it. And also because, I think the ethics of it are pretty compelling. But there's certainly sort of quietly a lot of pushback. And I think it takes a few different forms. So, I mean, one is, certainly there is just sort of outright, industry lobbying to keep some of the in-kind transfer programs we have the way they are. I'll tell you one story of this, for example. I once found out that here in the U.S., back in the late 80s, early 90s, there were some studies that looked at what happens when you give people cash transfers instead of food stamps, right? So it was still food stamps back in the day. And, the results from these studies says that, people spend a little bit less on food, they spend more on some other things, but generally seem pretty positive. And I was sort of, it's interesting. How come nothing changed after those studies? And so I went and tracked down the people at the Department of Agriculture, right? So Economic Research Service who had led those. And they said, actually the point of these studies was that we sometimes get pressure from Congress saying, like, why do we not just give money to people? Why do we have this big complicated bureaucracy to administer the food stamps? And so what we needed to do was to show that people spend more on food when we give them the food stamps than they would if we gave them the money. And then that justifies what we're doing because our constituency, the farm industry, is sort of benefits more from this approach than from the policy alternative, right? So there is that sort of quiet lobbying and that evidence generation coming from people who are the people whose stuff gets bought in the status quo, right? That's certainly one of them, right? I'd say the second big thing is there's just organizational inertia, right? That there are organizations who have done things the way they have for a long way. And, nobody is in principle opposed to a new way of doing things. But in terms of the practicalities of that, it's going to be threatening to people, their jobs, their opportunities. The humanitarian system, I think, is a good example of this, where it was built around these silos, right? So there are organizations that deal with nutrition, organizations that deal with shelter, organizations that deal with education. All of those are good goals, but it's not obvious where cash transfers fit in or which organization is going to do them. And so that's difficult to work out politically, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why progress there has been slow as well.
Yes, in the back.
Yes, thank you. Understanding that the logistic and financial difficulties of the question I'm about to propose, has anyone given thought to a long-term study to investigate the feasibility of actually creating like a resilient community? I would assume it'd have to be in a small rural village. My understanding of poverty is, it affects not only your financial well-being, but there's psychological harm and inability to invest in the future. So if we were able to give long-term direct cash investments into
a small village, let's say over a generation or over the course of a child's life, would we find in say 18, 20 years that village is something that's self-sustaining that would not need cash?
Great. So the question was, has anybody looked at what would happen if we made a sort of very long-term commitment to a program like this and what the kind of long-term consequences of that would be, right?
Yeah.
And so to provide a little bit of context, when I talked about the evidence on cash transfers earlier, this is most often looking at the impacts of government programs that you're eligible for a few years, maybe 5 years. Maybe there's some uncertainty because who knows what the next administration is going to do or whether they'll change eligibility, all that sort of thing, right? So, it's a little bit ambiguous, sort of how long-term is the commitment people are expecting here. So the reason I'm happy you asked that question is because we're running a study in Kenya in which we commit to giving people to transfers for a fairly long time, so 12-year period. That's part of the basic income project that I mentioned at the beginning. And part of the question, the thesis there is that maybe it does make a big difference if you expect the transfers to continue for a long time as opposed to a short time in terms of the impacts that has. So we haven't published results from that yet. I think what I can say sort of, I guess this is being filmed, so it's sort of on the record. But, we have people there that are getting transfers for 12 years and other communities in which people are getting transfers for 2 years. And we go back and look at what's happening about 20 months in, right? So at a time when everybody's gotten the same amount of money to date, but they have different expectations about the future. And I see your hand up, but let me just finish and then you can come back. And so that matters, right? So I can tell you that, on some of the core outcomes we care about, there's sort of big differences in terms of what's happening in the economies of those villages, even though they've all received the same amount of money up until now. So my sort of initial hunch is that, it matters a lot, whether this is something that you expect is going to be there for a while or something that's, I got to take advantage of this now and it's going to stop. What was your follow-up?
When you're talking about the 12-year group, are they told ahead of time that they're going to have a 12-year time, or are they under the assumption that it could go on to perpetuity?
Right. Well, it would be very weird if there were different effects and they hadn't been told, right? So in some sense that answers the question. But yeah, they're told. How much they actually believe that is obviously an open question, but the data seem to say that they believed it.
I will not.
Great.
Awesome. All right, get in the back.
Me?
You.
I'm Brennan, a PhD student here at Stanford. I was thinking about implementation, like how does the way you transfer the cash, if it's like cash or wire or digital, does that matter regardless of the outcome you're measuring? Because I'm thinking about humanitarian and humanitarian situations, because maybe it's not feasible in a humanitarian situation to transfer digitally. So how much does this matter?
Yeah, there's the question was sort of, does the modality matter, whether we give people money electronically or actually distribute paper money? There's been a bunch on this, and a lot of it does come to feasibility, right? Sort of like, do we get money to people on time? Is everybody able to collect it, right? So as opposed to do they then use it somehow differently because of the way in which it was given to them? There's been a little bit on that. I think especially around some of these questions on food security, there's been a little bit on that. But I think the kind of core question has been what actually works to get them the money. The thing that's a little bit funny about it is sometimes the distinctions are not as sharp as you might think. So people often talk about paying money through a bank account. But it's not sort of what you and I would imagine, that they then go to an ATM and withdraw when they want. It's more like the bank sends out a truck, right? And then people queue up and they authenticate, and sort of get their money out of there. And so, yes, it was in an account in some sense, and that there was a computer server somewhere that said that you had money in there, right? But the actual distribution of it ends up looking pretty similar, right? For Give Directly, most of what we do is through mobile money. And so we'll give people a SIM card or a phone and they'll register for a mobile money account and send money to them digitally, but most of them will then go to a nearby agent and withdraw it and spend it as cash because the fee structure of mobile money generally makes that the best way to do it. So it's a little bit blurry in terms of those things. But, yeah.
A quick question. It was actually, my initial question was about fade out after the treatment ends the cash transfer. So you answered that in terms of the 12-year and the 2-year program in Kenya. And then my colleague here brought up a good point. What about eligibility criteria for 12-year versus 2-year versus control?
Great. So the question was, what are the eligibility criteria in that study, right, where 12 years, 2 years, and how should we interpret the results given that? So the way that study works, because it is sort of universal basic income, is that every adult in the communities gets money, and they continue to get it for as long as the program runs. So there's no reassessment of eligibility. There's no initial means testing to see who's poor, who's rich, or any of that, right? And that is unusual, right? So most of these cash transfer programs have been means tested in some way, right? The government doesn't have income tax data to know how much everybody's making. It's typically based on much simpler things like what your house is built out of, things like that. But this that study is somewhat unique in that there's no means testing at all, and that's true dynamically, right, as well as initially.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, the 2 years, I think, let's say they graduation, have you gone back to see if they're falling back in poverty, or have there been a follow-up on those households that have left poverty?
We will for sure, yeah. We haven't done that yet, yeah, but the plan is to track all of these groups over the long term.
Just a quick question. When you were comparing cash transfers with other policies that were existing in some form, if we now see, can we draw any kind of inference regarding the structure and timing of the payments for like a micro insurance policy or a microfinance policy for climate change, as that's going to be more and more prevalent? How do we draw some?
Great, yeah. So the question was, how should we think about structuring cash transfers, sort of relative to a microinsurance or a microcredit program? So let me start, and then you can tell me if I'm getting to the core of your question. So for microcredit, I think there's definitely been interest in ways to make the product more flexible, to provide more different structures that might work better for different people. And so I think that sort of microcredit is ahead of cash transfers on that dimension. Yeah. For insurance, I actually think that in some cases, the best approach may be to build it right into a cash transfer program. Right, so there are some places in which, sort of really innovative structures where you have a social protection program, and then you also purchase some insurance, at the regional or national level against big aggregate risks like drought, and those contracts then pay out, right, and you're able to increase the generosity of your program. So you're building insurance right into the cash transfer program. So I think that's a very desirable approach and way for dealing with the more aggregate risks, and there's a lot of movement in the direction, sort of under the rubric of shock protective or shock responsive social protection. Right? That's kind of the jargon around it. So, which is sort of ironic because social protection is meant to protect you from shocks in the first place. So it's a little weird, but so there's kind of movement in that direction. I think the harder one are the little idiosyncratic risks where like someone in your family gets sick, they can't work anymore, you lose their income, you have to pay for their medical bills. For that, it's not as clear how to build that into a cash transfer program per se, as opposed to trying to roll out universal basic medical insurance, things like that. But I think that's an interesting frontier to think about. So how much did that get to your question?
80%.
That's above my average. So.
How about one more in the back?
I was just curious, kind of on a similar vein, if in the evidence base you've noticed if there's any like policy coupling with unconditional cash transfers that like make the effects better or worse.
Great. Yeah. So question was, are there any things that you can pair with unconditional cash transfers?
No, not compare with, but like.
So sorry, pair.
Oh, okay.
Not compare, pair. Couple, as you said, right? Yeah, sorry. So this is a good question. I don't think there have been some studies in this genre that really sort of I think motivated primarily by the work on graduation packages, which are these bundles of things. And so it's less coming from the like, what can we pair with cash transfers, and more from the like, how much can we unbundle that to make it simpler and cheaper to deliver. So there has been a little bit on that. Stuff that we've done at Give Directly, there have been one or two things like this we've done where we paired cash transfers with more psychological interventions. So there's what I think some very interesting research on people's aspirations, sort of how much they dare to dream and think that their lives can get better. And I think that's a tricky thing because for some people there may not be that much scope, but there's evidence that sometimes you can encourage people to kind of think bigger and to feel more optimistic about the future. And so we've done research, for example, looking at the intersection of that with cash transfers. And that ended up being very interesting. So it seems like the aspirations intervention raised people's aspirations and their outcomes. The cash transfers also raised people's aspirations and their outcomes. The two together sort of didn't have any complementarity. Right? So there's been a little bit. There are probably, you might have in mind some big buckets that would be natural to think about, which I do not think have been done. So I think pairing, redistribution with infrastructure investment, better roads, things like that, seems like from a big picture perspective, like an obvious question. I don't think that's been done. I think that would be very cool. So.
Oh, golly. Okay,
I want to find out, is cash transfer enough, or should it be complemented with other services in order to attain, the necessary best outcome in terms of household outcome, individual outcome, or even to the extent of community outcome?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is sort of, are cash transfers enough? And so, of course, it depends on enough or what. There are sort of many things I'd like to see changed in the world for which I think they're not going to be enough or not necessarily the best tool. I do think that we can chart a plausible path to ending extreme poverty using only cash transfers, and that's a very compelling vision and picture to paint. I also think there are going to be a lot of really high return things to do in addition to and alongside of that, which we should do as well. And as you can imagine, as an economist, those are often going to get to sort of bigger picture, community level issues, public health issues, things that have to do with externalities or public goods, which of course I don't expect individual transfers to fully address. So that's my broad framework for it. Obviously, that could be a 3-hour conversation in and of itself. But,
All right, before I let everyone go, before I let you go, could you share with us what has been the thing that you're most proud of in all this research and work with you directly? Just one that is sort of a translation of the policy. You already told me.
Proud of
so the question, I guess everybody heard of the question, is sort of what am I most proud of? So it's funny because we do all the rigorous impact evaluation, and so we can, I can tell you sort of very personally moving moments when we saw the data, the impact that this was having that were for me very powerful. I think the thing where it's hardest to establish causality is also the most important thing, which is the dialogue has clearly shifted dramatically, right, from that quote that I showed you then to today, many people saying yeah, this makes sense. Of course, we should be doing more of this. We have to figure out how and who and when and all that, but it's sort of agreeing, right? And so we know we've contributed to that shift. We know we're not the only ones, but we've been a part of that, and having the audacity to say, yep, that's it, that's all. We're just going to give money to people. That made a difference. And so I think that's the thing that I'm most proud of, even though it is hardest to say, what percentage of it was us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really good news. There's a reception right after this. You have to grab calls and ask more questions while you're enjoying wine or other beverages. There's upstairs, and I want to thank Duke Population Institute for their funding for the event, and Duke Center for International Development for the reception, and support from the Duke Center for Child and Family Health here at Stanford. Thank you again for coming, and this is upstairs.
Thank you.